Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm Peter Lavelle. I'm joined this morning by Dmitry Babich, a good friend of the Gaggle, and we're going to update our viewers on what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh. I pass the baton over to you, Demon. What's the state in play in that part of the world?
Well, there are two important news. The first important news is that on the 18th, the two sides were supposed to start another ceasefire. But this morning, both Armenia and Azerbaijan are already reporting cases when their villages and towns were fired upon. Well, not on the territory of Armenia proper, but on the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. The locals report that they were shot at from the Azerbaijani side. Azerbaijanis report that several Azerbaijani villages and towns were shot at, the ones that are located near the combat zone. And let me remind you that officially, of course, that the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh is the territory of Azerbaijan. So as far as Russia is involved, Nagorno-Karabakh is not a party to Collective Security Treaty Organization, which means that Russia is not obliged to react. If Armenia proper is attacked, then Russia will be obliged to react.
So, why? Obviously there are many people on both sides that don't want to see this ceasefire come into effect. Particularly, I would say the Azerbaijan side, because it appears that they thought that they could have a quick victory, overwhelm Nagorno-Karabakh, but it hasn't happened here. One of the interesting things also that's in play is that we haven't heard a whole lot from Erdogan over the last couple of days, which he played such a very important public role, at least over the last couple of weeks here. What's in play there? Because Moscow is putting a lot of political capital on the line here to get a ceasefire to work.
Well, the second important news from the combat zone, by the way, is the Azerbaijani side declared that they took control of several villages in those 7 districts, which are not Karabakh itself, but which are Azerbaijani areas controlled by Armenians and making up the so-called security zone. So President Aliyev is more or less delivering on his promise, to at least liberate 2 districts. But of course, the word liberation is very ironic here, because the losses may be much bigger than the gains for both sides, because they both have such destructive weapons. But you are right, Turkey, well, Mr. Erdogan just recently made a statement that you should not accuse us of supplying weapons to Baku, because Russia and the Minsk group countries, which means the United States and France, they're all supplying weapons to Armenia. Well, they're not supplying weapons to Armenia for free. Armenia buys weapons, and of course, Azerbaijan buys a lot more because its budget is bigger. But if we look at the situation in a wider context, when did the wars on the territory of the former Soviet Union start? When the Soviet Union was collapsing, and in general, that's how wars for territory start. Nationalists in various republics of the former Soviet Union, when Moscow became weaker, they saw it as the moment of opportunity. Like mountains are moving, we can gain so much territory now. If we act now, there won't be another opportunity in the next maybe 100 years. So both Armenian nationalists, Azerbaijani nationalists, Moldovan nationalists, Georgian nationalists, they started acting back in the end of the Soviet Union, trying to gain as much territory as possible before Moscow gets stronger. Then there was a certain hiatus when Moscow indeed somehow stabilized the situation in both Georgia and Moldova. There were important entities there where minorities were protected. And then it restarted again in 2008, basically because of NATO's disastrous decision to announce that it would expand not only to the former Warsaw Treaty countries, or the Soviet bloc countries if you want, but also to the territory of the former Soviet Union. NATO not only took the Baltics, but they said we're going to take Ukraine and Georgia. And then nationalists again felt like, oh, this is the moment.
Right.
NATO is on our side. Mountains are moving again. Let's start acting. In the next 50 years, maybe we won't have another opportunity. So immediately you had new wars in Ukraine. You had a new war in Georgia, where Saakashvili tried to gain more territory because he felt like NATO was behind him. And I think this war in Karabakh is a part of the same process, because Azerbaijan feels like, okay, Moscow is not really going to get seriously involved. Armenia is more or less isolated geographically. We have so much more weapons. We have so much more money. At least we will take the territories around Nagorno-Karabakh, and if we're lucky, maybe we're going to take it all. And the rhetoric from the Azerbaijani authorities is very much like the rhetoric from Kiev. You know, they say that, oh, people living in Nagorno-Karabakh, they're also citizens, okay, they're Armenians, but they will be a minority inside Azerbaijan. And in general, I must tell you that Azerbaijanis are very tolerant people. I mean, Baku was one of the most multi-ethnic cities in the former Soviet Union, and it's still a very nice place for foreigners. I do advise to visit. But Armenians are an exception, because for 30 years there was so much negative, let's put it mildly, negative information about them, that Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh, they have serious concerns that maybe Mr. Aliyev will be nice to us, you know, at least rhetorically. What will happen during the night? What will happen when you meet Azerbaijani officials coming there? So, and Armenians on their side, they are not even talking about allowing Azerbaijani refugees back to Nagorno-Karabakh. It's just,
I mean, Armenians are hypersensitive to that, considering the genocide committed against them during and after the First World War. And you know, and ethnic cleansing, unfortunately, is not an unknown concept in that part of the world. So, I mean, they have. I mean, as you and I have spoken many times, for the Armenians, it's very existential. It's not a little bit or a more or less. It is patently existential in their mind.
Well, it's true, but on the other side, we must say that these were not Azerbaijanis who committed the genocide of 1915. Azerbaijan was never a part of the Ottoman Empire. Even before it became a part of the Russian Empire, it was a part of Iran. So basically, I mean, we understand, it's possible to understand the concerns of Armenians, but in the case of Azerbaijan, they're a little bit misguided, because 1915 had nothing to do with Baku, you know. Correct. There were clashes later on when Armenia and Azerbaijan became, for a short time, independent countries. But again, that's what I told you in the beginning. Moscow, when it got weaker because of the civil war, then the clashes started between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. When you have a strong power in Moscow and you have a more or less stable situation, the two communities, they lived together for 70 years. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of Armenians living in Azerbaijan, especially in Baku. And there was no problem about that until Moscow got weak, and nationalists on both sides, you know, in Armenia and Azerbaijan, felt like mountains were moving, and now is the opportunity. Now is the opportunity also to expel minorities, you know. You may not expel them for the next 100 of years unless you expel them now. So that was also kind of invitation to basically very, very harsh measures on both sides when the central authority in the Soviet Union weakened. And so we have these waves, you know, and the problem is that the West basically set itself the aim of weakening Moscow's influence in that area. So Moscow influence, they're trying to weaken it, and they're not suggesting anything to replace it. So please note that, you know, new waves of wars in the former Soviet Union start when Moscow gets weaker and the West gets stronger, expanding its influence. That was the case in, at the moment of the collapse of the Soviet Union. That repeated itself in 2008, 2014. Now we have another echo of that in Karabakh. And unless Moscow gets stronger and starts acting, we may have a repetition in the future also. And little by little, Moscow is starting to realize this.
The important thing is that the two antagonists, Azerbaijan and Armenia, are looking to Moscow for some kind of diplomatic out, and that's an important thing to remember, and that's the most powerful card to play right now. Though I want to echo your sentiment here. The West's involvement in this is not for peace. It's not for sovereignty. None of these highfalutin ideas. It's just to cause a quagmire and make Russia sweat for it, which I don't think is going to happen. On the other hand, there's no light at the end of the tunnel in the sense that we're going to see this frozen conflict resolved anytime soon, unfortunately. Last thoughts, Dima, go ahead.
I just wanted to tell you, if we are criticized by some of our listeners for maybe being too pessimistic about the West, tell me about one conflict that the European Union has been able to end since its creation, since its inception in 1992. They didn't stop the conflict in Yugoslavia. They basically destroyed the country. They didn't stop the conflict. They didn't stop the conflict in Syria. They didn't stop the conflict in Iraq. So if I were an Armenian or an Azerbaijani living in that area, I would say, if the EU failed in so many cases, how can we look up to it to resolve our conflict? Moscow resolved several conflicts, and that's why the hopes of the population in that region are connected to Moscow and not to the West.
Well, and also we have to point out, since you mentioned it, the EU brokered a deal in Ukraine in the spring of 2014, and immediately after the coup, they walked away from it as if, they had never met Yanukovych. I mean, it shows a real spineless attitude. Hours before they were patting him on the back, okay, and then later they just washed their hands of something that they were very, very deeply involved, because Ukraine could have had a very different trajectory, and I blame the Europeans for it, because they didn't keep their word. The ink on the document hadn't even dried, and they walked away from it. That is just completely irresponsible.
And now Poroshenko says, we can't find that document in our archives. It just disappeared. Well, billions of people saw on television that agreement between Yanukovych and the opposition was signed in the presence of the foreign ministers of France, Germany, Poland. And now Poroshenko says, we can't find it. It never happened.
Thank you very much, Dima, for that update on what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh and the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia as Russia continues to mediate this long-standing conflict, which, as I've said earlier, will remain a frozen conflict. It just will get down to how it's managed. Okay, if you like this, like, share, and subscribe, and the Gaggle will have a whole lot more for you during this week.